Hey, welcome to Capstone. I want to have some fun this week. Nothing too serious. I know you're gathering information probably, or just about at that stage. But I want to skip ahead a little bit and talk about the art of narrative and storytelling. So you may be thinking it's a little too early for this, and maybe it is. It is in terms of writing it because you're probably a few weeks away from that. But thinking about it, thinking about your narrative, I think is an important way that you can make a really powerful presentation, particularly, but also essay when you're doing your final essay. And so you might not be thinking, my content analysis is a story that I'm telling, or my critical discourse analysis is a story, but it is. It's a story. And it has good guys and bad guys, and it has exciting events and resolutions and all of these kinds of interesting things that make a story, even if you're not thinking of it like that. And it's obviously very individual to each of you because one person's story is not going to be the same as another, but there are certain factors that make interesting and good stories, good in terms of stories that people want to tell and retell. And if you do it right, that's how your study should work. You should be thinking about how you want to tell a story of your research findings and of your situation, of the situation you're studying, and you want people to retell it because it's such a powerful narrative. And so anyway, it sounds a little weird, but I want you to think about how your work can be put into a narrative structure. And so you might not have all the pieces yet, and that's fine, but if you start thinking about it now, it'll be much easier later to do. So first of all, there are good guys and bad guys in all stories, right? And it's a very simple dynamic, and I don't want you to necessarily say, I've looked at two companies, here's the good guy, here's the bad guy. But maybe the bad guy, for example, is ideology. So you are exploring an ideology you think is bad, racism, and that's the bad guy. And the good guy is maybe this story that you found in certain narratives, in certain newspapers, in certain commercials, in certain video games or whatever, right? And so it's important. So in my example, right, if I look at men and women and people in video games, characters in video games tend to have really good stories. And so they have good guys and bad guys, and you're usually the good guy and you're killing the bad guys or fighting the bad guys. And so I don't want you to confuse the story that you are studying, so the narratives in the video games, with your narrative. So your narrative is maybe something like, rather than a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, there were rebels and there was the Empire, right? If you're studying Star Wars, then that's the story of Star Wars, but that's not your story. Instead, maybe it's something like, not a long, long time ago, but in 2020, in a country called America, people were fighting. And they were fighting about this intellectual idea. Some people thought that men should be like this and women should be like this. Other people were questioning that, and they had two competing ideas. And so again, it's an interesting story because there's some kind of conflict. And if there's no conflict, then you're studying something that, people have already agreed upon, and why are you doing that? I mean, either there's disagreement already, or you are bringing a disagreement to something that most people take for granted and haven't thought about yet. And so you're the good guy or the bad guy, depending on who we're talking about, right? But either way, there's some kind of disagreement, and it doesn't have to be for world domination or the galactic empire. Instead, it can be for, how should men and women be treated? Or what kind of political agency should citizens have? Or how should journalists portray what's going on in the world in a way that fits better than what's happening today in the representations? And so there's some kind of conflict, and I want you to identify that. And likely, you already have, you just haven't thought of it as a conflict. You've thought of it as, here are two competing ideas, or here are two issues. And sometimes it's three, right? It doesn't always have a dual nature, but usually there's some kind of spectrum, right? So like on this side, people are doing this, and on this side, people are doing that. So where is your conflict? I want you to try to identify your conflict because, again, it doesn't have to be literal fighting or anything, but some kind of disagreement. One group of people think this, one group of people thinks this. Your conflict builds your story. There should be obviously a beginning And that can sometimes be arbitrary because, the further back in traditions and in human culture, the more we see that this didn't actually start here. It started here and then it grew into this. And so you can always go back. But you might want to start with, let's say, PlayStation 1 came out this year and pushed people to start thinking about the world in a different way or thinking about games in a different way, right? That could be your beginning. Or the first Super Bowl commercials began airing this year, and during that time, people began to watch more and more and have expectations more and more of what they would see during Super Bowls, and those kinds of commercials led people to certain expectations, right? So at some point, your story starts. And it doesn't mean that it's the very beginning of the world because, you can't go back that far. But your story starts. And it's helpful if your story starts with what authors sometimes call like an exciting or, an exciting incident, right? That incident, whatever it is, sparks something. And that spark leads to a bigger issue that you develop in your lit review, maybe in your study itself. So there's a structure to a story, beginning, middle, and end. It's easy for you in this project because the beginning is usually historical, like when did this stuff that you're studying start? The middle is how it develops. And the end, for you at least, it can be right now. So you conclude with what your findings are and where we are right now. Maybe that's the ending for now, to be continued. Or maybe it is in the future, and so you say, the story hopefully ends with XYZ happening, and that's what my study tries to shed light on, and that's where I hope we are going. So your story can be a little bit into the future, perhaps, the ending. So you can break it up in different ways, but I encourage you to think about what is the beginning, middle, and end of your story? What is the conflict? And how are you bringing people aboard your story, right? So usually you introduce something that's exciting, but not super difficult to understand. And then it builds to a little bit more complexity. And then there's this crescendo at the end where you kind of let things fit into place, right? That's what I want you to think about in terms of your the end of your discussion. That's where you say, okay, this thing that's been building and building and building, maybe it's not totally resolved, but here are some simple things that we can do to think better or to continue this kind of scholarship. That's usually the end of the movie where the characters either go off into the sunset or you see like 5 years later, this guy's doing this and this guy's doing this and he went on to build this. And so that's sort of what you can look at. You don't want to make it a cliche and you don't want to make it overly dramatized to the point where, it gets a little ridiculous. But if you think about it as the story of my research project, it can be you can be the main protagonist, but you can also have a different protagonist, right? Maybe your protagonist is Michel Foucault, who started thinking about the prison in a different way, right? Or sexuality in a different way. Maybe it's somebody who argued for something and you're continuing to look at that argument by analyzing newspaper articles or what have you. But somewhere it starts, somewhere it builds, and somewhere things conclude, maybe not 100%, but there's some kind of conclusion or closure. You feel like, okay, that's wrapped up for now. Maybe there'll be a part 2, but for now, we know where we stand. That's what I want you to practice this week, just kind of putting things into perspective in terms of a narrative, and you can build on that, you can make it better as we continue to work and as we start to set up these presentations that you'll do for the end of the term. You'll think about it more and you'll have more data, you'll have more findings that you'll be able to discuss, and so it'll be easier. But if now you think, what's the struggle going on? Who is the good guy and bad guy? And again, that's a very simple way to put it, but if you start like that, here's a conflict. Here's what's at stake in that conflict. Again, maybe it's not the future of the universe, but it's how do we represent what it means to be a man or a woman today, and whose life is on the line. And many times you might be surprised that there are actual lives on the line, right? If we vilify people of color, for example, then what we see with police brutality will probably escalate. What we see with people mistreating others will probably escalate, right? So that is at stake. What we see about gender expression, right? You're going to have more or less hate crimes, perhaps, the more people see the world as this or as this. And so there are real life repercussions. Even if your study is not the one thing that will change all of that, that's not what's important. What's important is the bigger picture of, why are you studying this? You're studying it because these are the people at stake. These are the issues at stake. This is the conflict. This is what you're bringing, and you're wrapping it up here and to be continued by another author perhaps, or by you in another project. Story is important, and I wish people were more often encouraged to think of their work, Capstone, communication studies, what have you, as story, because it makes a really big difference. That said, I hope you enjoy the story that you're writing, and I hope you remember that it should be engaging and fun, not just a slog that you have to do. And that will make a huge difference as well. Authors tend to like the worlds they make. You're starting with, nonfiction world, but you get to create the trajectory, you get to write about it in the way that you want, and so you get to tell this story of your work. And so think about it, enjoy it, and I look forward to talking to you each one-on-one.